Ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
Are you ready?
Okay, here we go.
You're listening to the Deal Room Podcast. Join us as we bring you the inside scoop on business sales and acquisitions. Get across trends in the area and hear the industry's best recount their real-life tips, traps, and experiences. Now, here's your host, Joanna Oakey.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here and welcome back to the Deal Room Podcast, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. Now we have part 2 of the 2-part series about industry-specific issues relating to valuations and business sales and acquisitions in the veterinary industry. If you missed part 1, then I highly recommend you go back and listen to that first. So just go back to the podcast that's just sitting above this one in your favourite podcast player. But if you've listened to part 1, then lock in for part 2. This is a really useful episode to round out this discussion that we're having today. In this part 2, we're looking at the types of multiples that veterinary practices can sell for and the difference between getting a low multiple versus a high multiple. We look at selling out to corporates versus selling out perhaps to our staff or other third-party buyers. We also look at the concept of earnouts, and we look at a lot of issues relating to the sorts of elements that you need to be thinking about when priming a business for sale to ensure that the value of that business is something that can transfer over to the buyer and to leave you with the maximum amount of cash in your pocket at the end of the day after sale. And we have back on the show Anne and Paolo Lencioni from APL Accountants and also from ValueVet, who are in absolute industry veterans and professionals here because they've both worked as veterinary surgeons and then followed on to become accountants and working in their own accounting practice after working in their own veterinary practice. So they really understand the industry in a very deep way, and it leads to a really great discussion in this part 2 of our 2-part series. So without further ado, here we go with Anne and Paolo. Well, Anne and Paolo, I just want to say a very big welcome back to part 2 of this really interesting discussion all about the veterinary industry and valuations and sales and acquisitions within this industry. As I said at the beginning of part 1, have no fear if you're coming in to listen to this podcast and you're not in the veterinary industry, it's still really relevant to hear some of the things that we're talking about because we're really touching on a lot of elements that are really relevant for you to consider in relation to what's specific to your specific industry. So what we're talking about from a broad sense is the ability to go deep within your industry and the benefits of understanding your industry in a sale environment or acquisition environment, or even just in a business environment itself. So Anne and Paolo, thank you so much for coming back onto the show today.
Good to be back.
Thanks for having us.
Great. Okay, now I have got so many questions for you. But what I'd like to just perhaps start on is in part 1, we had a little bit of a discussion towards the end about some of the clients that have been referred to you by more generalist accountants and some of the reasons behind that. And I think it's a really important topic to consider because we have lots of accountants who are listening in, and I think maybe it's really useful for them to understand what some of the reasons are, and perhaps in the past where you've had accountants who have been generalists, who have referred veterinary clients into you for valuations and dealing with the acquisition and sales side. What are some of the reasons for that, and what are some of the benefits? And I guess on the flip side, what are some of the risks if they're trying to hold this themselves without knowing the industry?
So I think generally accountants that are familiar with valuations would most likely understand that it's very different depending on the industry type. So unless you are experienced in an industry type, I think you are likely to feel a little bit uncomfortable. It's not just about knowing the multiplier, but as we discussed in part 1, it's also knowing the things to look at in the financials, the things that you may need to adjust for. So the adjustments are, if anything, more important than the multiple, because if you get your adjustments wrong, it can make a significant difference. So I think if you don't understand an industry, you'd probably feel a little bit uncomfortable. And as we said in part one, I know I would not be at all comfortable doing a valuation for another industry, although I do a lot of valuations for the veterinary industry. I wouldn't want to touch on another industry. We've had, we only deal with vets, and we have clients whose spouses will own other businesses. They've asked us for valuations, and we've actually said, look, we just don't feel we can do a good job of it. We don't understand the industry, and I don't think you'll get a good result because we don't know what the market does.
The one case was a motor car garage, which was a spouse of a vet, and we declined to do that. And they should go to someone who does that type of industry, because I don't know what multiple to use for that.
Yeah.
So that was one of the examples. You had another example, Anne, didn't you?
Yeah, we had a dry cleaner. Well, I was approached by someone who had a dry cleaning business, and we just don't know what the financials should look like. We don't know what dry cleaning businesses sell for, what sort of market there is, sort of how many buyers there are for that sort of business. So I wouldn't feel at all comfortable, and I wouldn't want the risk of undervaluing for the seller, and then it sells really quickly, and they could have got a lot more money. I feel I'd be letting my client down if they were selling. And if my client was the buyer, I would hate to overvalue and they overspend, and then they suffer for years with a business they've overpaid for and a debt that they can't afford to pay back because they overpaid for the business.
I think it's a really good point. Yeah, and I guess it all comes back to this concept of specialization and niching, which is, if you're really interested, we'll put somewhere in the show notes and link back to a discussion that Paolo and I had in the past, specifically really focusing in on this niching concept, which is actually a really interesting concept from a business perspective, but not exactly relevant to what we're talking about today. But we do a lot of work obviously in the business sales and acquisition space, and of course that's why we have this podcast here that you're listening to today. But I think it's comparable to people sometimes think that a lawyer must know about business sales and acquisitions because they do contracts or that's stuff that a lawyer does, but there are so many nuances in the sale and acquisition environment that most lawyers who, your average commercial solicitor maybe gets at absolute best one every month or two business sale and acquisition, whereas we might be sitting in any month on 40 or 50 or more sales and acquisitions that we're processing in a particular month. So there's just like you're processing so many veterinary practices, you just get such a feel for everything that happens in the process and how to move things along and what are some of the sticking points that people who don't have so much industry depth, I guess, just don't get the exposure to.
And we've really noticed that on the legal side, because we have had clients that have chosen their own lawyer, and we know just from the questions we get from the lawyer that the lawyer really is out of their depth and don't really understand what's involved in the sales. So it is, we can see it even with the lawyers that they've got to use somebody that actually knows what they're doing. It's really important.
Great point. Okay, fabulous. Well, self-serving on my behalf, of course, very clearly.
Not because of any reason, except that I get really annoyed when my clients aren't properly treated and they've gone to the wrong person and not getting the advice they really need. So.
Yeah. Okay, fabulous. All right. So we touched on, some of the issues being, a lack of understanding the multiples. So why don't we get deep into multiples? And just a bit of a warning here. I just want to be really clear that just because we're talking about the multiples doesn't mean that you know so much about the value of your own practice now that you don't need specific assistance in this area. We're not trying to provide enough information for you to go and do damage to yourself or your own practice. Give it a bit of an overview. Let's dive into the multiples. What's the sort of range that you see in multiples for veterinary practices, and what can impact where on the range veterinary practices sit?
So first, I'll actually interject there and say that when applying a multiple, if you're going to apply a multiple, please listen to part one of the podcast, because you're only applying a multiple once a significant amount of accounting adjustments are made. Right? Don't just immediately assume you can just apply a multiple to profit. The multiple is the last part of a very, very long process.
So what people see as a multiple, we work on, what we actually work on is what the profit is going to be for the business likely sustainably going forwards, and then sort of what sort of percentage return you would expect on the investment you're making. So we normally talk in percentages, but if you were going to convert that into a multiplier, which is sort of how people think, it would really be 3 to 6. And 6 is really more on the top end. If you're looking at a corporate buyer, you're not going to find, and that's because of a whole lot of conditions that come with it. If you're not going with a corporate buyer, you're probably looking at 3 to 5.
Okay, all right. So let's stick, and I really want to talk about this corporate buyer option, because obviously sometimes the multiples that people can see does sound very attractive on the face of it. So let's just call it out and get into, a bit of a balanced view of it. But just before we go there, just sticking with the non-corporate buy multiple, what are some of the things that impact where in that 3 to 5 a veterinary practice might end up sitting?
So things like what we discussed in part 1 is where they're situated. So are they in a city or are they quite rural? Because city practices, they're more buyers. So the prices for city practices are higher. So we'd use a better multiplier for those. Things like the type of work they do. So again, I think we mentioned in part 1, do they just do small animal work, so just dogs and cats, or is it a mixed practice? Mixed practices are harder to sell. There's not as big a market. So again, would be a lower multiplier. You've also got to look at something like how much revenue does the seller generate, because if they're bringing in a lot of the revenue, then if they're stepping out altogether, it makes the clinic a bit less valuable because a lot of the goodwill is attached to one person and there's the risk associated of them exiting and then some of those clients leaving as well. So some of the goodwill going. Paolo, do you want to add to some of those?
The other thing we would look at is the pricing of the practice. So are their prices low, medium or high? So we compare them to our price benchmarking. We know a practice that has high prices is a better buy because they've catered to a better customer market. So a practice that can afford to has a lot of clients but has still got high prices is going to have a better value than one that has low prices. So that's one of the other things we look at. One of the other things we mentioned in part 1 is we always look at 3 years worth of financials. A practice that has got significant revenue growth over 3 years will value it higher than one that has got revenue growth. It's level or it's actually declining. So that'll also affect what sort of multiplier we'd apply to that particular business.
Fabulous.
And then how well equipped they are. Have they got a lot of old equipment that's going to need replacing, or they're missing some key pieces of equipment? Because then obviously whoever buys is going to have to usually would want to buy the bits of equipment that are missing, or there's going to be equipment they need to replace. So there's a cost when they buy in. So that would, make the practice a bit less valuable. You got to look at that expense.
A big element there, for example, a good example of that would be if they got really old practice management system running very old servers, because we know that there's a huge pain point in changing your whole point of sale software, retraining all the staff and replacing servers that could be 30 or 40 grand and are about to blow up in the next 6 months. So all that sort of stuff has to be taken into account also in terms of the value of the business.
And of course, part of that is about the exit planning side as well, isn't it? Because I guess, maybe really practice owners should be thinking about what their exit plans are before they're making really substantial investments into things like this area. If perhaps they're planning on selling to a corporate buyer, it might be that a corporate buyer comes in with their own systems that they'll overlay anyway. And, you might say, okay, well, it's better not to be spending money on that. But if they have other factors that are at play that make them less likely to want to sell to a corporate buyer, then, maybe it's a really good move. So it depends, doesn't it? They should have an idea of what exit looks like first in their opportunities, their options, before they're making some of those substantial capital decisions.
Yeah, because I think the things we look at are not necessarily things that the corporates look at with their multiplier. They would look at certain factors to decide whether they'd want to buy the clinic. And then the multiplier I don't think is as varied as our multiplier, because if it's a clinic they want, then it's going to be the higher multiplier regardless. They don't look at all the factors that we look at. They've got their own criteria of how they choose what businesses they want.
That highlights actually that the corporates will only target very specific types of practices.
Yeah. So what are they then? What is the kind of business that they're looking for?
I mean, I can't say what they're looking for and that we don't know them and what they're looking for. I get the feeling it's generally, there has to be at least 2 vets in the business. Generally, they're small animal only. There are occasions where they'll buy a mix, but generally they prefer small animal only. Paolo, what else?
They look at
Depends on
high
the
net
buyer.
profit margin practices that are already running at a high net profit margin.
Not necessarily. They do buy, depending on, so there's also different corporates. So some corporate, the different corporate players have their own criteria. So it's not even the same between the corporate
across
players.
the board. There
are corporates that would turn away a clinic that doesn't have high profitability, and I know of another corporate that has immediately gone and snapped it up. So they, they have their own criteria for whatever reasons. So I don't think profitability is necessarily a factor that's dependent on the corporate.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because other industries which are similar in many ways, perhaps in different phases of where they are in the aggregated model. So dental has gone through a period of high levels of aggregation, and I get the sense that in the veterinary industry, it's sort of still at early phases. Like, where are you seeing that we are in this level of aggregation?
Paolo, do you want to comment?
Yeah, it's again, because it's our industry and we keep track of it. Like, we know that in the United Kingdom, for example, it's much further along the route than what it is here in Australia. We know in the USA it started a lot earlier than in the UK, but never actually reached the level of aggregation that it did in the UK. So clearly, the British market was much more amenable to a corporate model. And in Australia, it started, like, of the countries we've worked in or worked as vets in Australia, it's actually started the latest. So I wouldn't say it's in the early phases anymore. It's been going on now probably, Anne, for what, six years or longer?
Oh, you go back to the biggest original player. It goes back further than that. So it has actually been going on. It's been going on quite a while.
Yeah. It was originally only one major player. But they seem to have struggled to they seem to get momentum and then back off a little bit again. So you also never know how long they're going to carry on acquiring for.
And I think one of the differences with veterinary and other businesses like dental, veterinary business employs a lot more staff because they run the full hospital behind the scenes as well.
Yeah.
So you're not just buying, the consulting side of it. There's the whole hospitalization side, plus there's a full theatre. So, there's a lot more staff. So I think it makes it harder for a corporate model than some of the other professional services. So I think that's also why it's been a bit slower, because it's not as easy with all the professional staff you require.
Okay, fabulous. So then if we stick with this discussion about the corporate buyer, let's really dig into what the differences might be. So obviously we've talked about, well, here's the potential opportunity of a higher multiple with a corporate buyer. But what are we, if we're looking to exit, what are some of the factors that we should be really aware of in selling to a corporate buyer that might offset some of what might be perceived to be that advantage of the increased multiple?
So I think one of the big things is the earnouts. So what happens is they offer you a price up front based on around a 6 times multiplier. So the price on the, you think, oh, I'm getting X amount of money and it looks really good, but you're not usually getting that money up front. You're getting a part of it. So usually you get about 80% up front. And then depending on the corporate, what the sort of contract is, but you normally have to stay on for 2 to 3 years. And in those years, there are set criteria you have to reach each year in order to get a bit more of the money. So that balance of 20% would then be paid out to you over the next 2 to 3 years, but depending on you reaching certain targets. So you have to carry on working there. You can't sort of you can't just sell and exit for those that want to just retire.
And go on holidays.
Yeah. And you are required to reach certain targets. So you take the risk that the practice doesn't do as well as what you're thinking it would, because you've got to remember it's no longer under your management, it's under someone else's management. So you're taking that risk. And we do see it happen that people don't actually reach their targets, so they don't get the rest of their money and they end up a little bit disappointed as a result.
I think I just have to call it out. Like, this is like many people who might still be listening to this who are in different industries might hear that and say, wow, what's that? Like the standard is 80% upfront, because that is actually in many industries a very, very high upfront component in comparison to the earnout for a corporate buy. But But I think it's really important points that you make here, because if you're counting the dollars that you think will end up in your pocket, and then you find that you actually have very limited control about what that earnout looks like. And, of course, this is part of the job of making sure things are right and fair and flow through correctly in the sale agreement that you're signing. But there's a lot at stake, and certainly that money should never be viewed as a sure thing.
Yes, it can't be viewed as a sure thing. And then, I've had sellers that are thinking of selling to corporate, and they've sat down and worked out that they'd prefer to stay on for another 3 years themselves, owning the business, because that 80% that they're guaranteed of often works out less than what they would get to a non-corporate buyer in 2 to 3 years' time if they've run the clinic well, and they're taking the profits from the clinic as well as their salary for those 2 to 3 years. Whereas when you're working for the corporate, you obviously, for that earnout period, you're only getting your salary. So as the owner, if you hold on to it for 2 to 3 years, you're getting your salary plus the business profits, and then you're getting probably 80% of what the corporate would have paid you from a private buyer. So overall, financially, you can, often end up better off.
I'm jumping up and down in my chair here because I've got to speak. This is so
surprised you managed to keep quiet so long. You never keep quiet.
This is so easily missed. And, from the corporate's perspective, was a really, really good strategy of theirs to lock buyers in, because people were just seeing this multiple, like this higher multiple, okay? Now, when we actually think about it, okay, and this is across any industry type, and we're talking about earnouts, okay? If you have a very, very profitable business, okay, and you're taking home $250,000, $300,000 a year. Okay, if you sell to someone who wants you to do a 3-year earnout and is then going to pay you a commercial wage of $100,000 a year, over 3 years, that is $600,000. Okay, that is your opportunity cost of sitting there working as an employee versus an entrepreneurial business owner. Like, do not underestimate your opportunity loss. If you had sat there at that business selling it to one of your employees for 3 more years and taken the profits, you would be $600,000 better off. So do not underestimate the opportunity loss there, and being going from a business owner of a profitable business to an employee. If you're a business owner of a not profitable business, it doesn't make a difference. But if it's a profitable business, then think about that opportunity cost to you. It's so important.
And I guess it's also not just about the money as well, because there's this saying, once you've run your own business for 5 years or more, you become effectively unemployable. And
that's me.
That's me. I can tell you a story. I can tell you a story on this.
Yeah. Tell us. I want to hear.
I can tell you love stories. Okay, so vets will enjoy. Will appreciate this. I used to run a veterinary practice that sold out to a corporate, and the owner there, like at that stage, it was only a 1-year earnout clause. And that
was in the old days. They did 1 year.
The pharmaceutical companies had this little gimmick where to remind owners that their dog needs vaccinating every day, you used to put this little fridge magnet on your fridge, and you used to press a button, and it used to count down 365 days. This guy hated working for the corporate so much that he'd put one of these fridge magnets on all the fridges at the hospital, and he'd press the button, and it was counting down his days.
I love it. That's such a good story. But it's so true, isn't it? The idea of being, obviously the idea of selling sometimes for business owners who are really busy having to run a business, as well as, sit in the seat of dealing with patients. I guess it's another thing entirely, though, to be working at the behest of someone else and having to follow someone else's direction. And sometimes it's a bit of an emotional roller coaster that people just don't realise until they're in it, is a bit of a ball and chain.
And I think sometimes they're told to do things in a certain way, or, there's a protocol, obviously, because you're working for someone else, and then they're dealing with the clients on the ground, having to implement those changes, and then they're getting the pushback from the clients, and they can't treat the clients the way they used to or do the things they used to, because it's not theirs to make those decisions. So they're forced to do things in a way that they're maybe not comfortable with, but they're having to face the clients doing that, and they may just not feel that comfortable doing it because it's not what they would normally do.
Yeah.
So I think it can be, I think that's why sometimes some business owners are counting down, because it's not the way they would necessarily want to do.
It's very hard when you're looking at customers, particularly in this kind of industry where you've had a relationship with some people for 15, 20 years, and suddenly having policy dictated to you from up top from someone who possibly isn't even a veterinarian.
Yeah.
You might not agree with some of those policies, yet you're having to push them to clients you've had a long-standing relationship with. For some people, that would be fine. For others, I think, 3 years of doing that might be really, really tough.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point. And so is there anything else, I guess, just rounding out this discussion about the corporates, before we move into the next side, is there anything else that you think worthy of pointing out if you were considering selling to a corporate?
I think some of them also, some vets are selling out because they're really struggling to get staff. So they feel, they'll make that someone else's worry. They can just work in the business and not have to worry about getting staff. But what happens is it's no easier for the corporates to get staff than it is for the individual clinics. So they're still short staffed. They're still having to cover the extra shifts, because there's no magical one because a corporate buys you, suddenly you're fully staffed and got all great staff. Corporates have the same staffing issues. So it's not going to just take that staffing headache away from you. And there's sometimes this thing, it's just so hard to get people and I'm struggling, with the rosters and everything. I'll just sell to the corporate and stay on, and, they think it'll all just go away, and it doesn't necessarily.
It also depends how sentimental you are about your legacy of your business. And I know we're accountants and we're talking money and blah, blah, blah. But, when you're looking at a medical profession, for some people, and certainly for some of our clients, the legacy of having that business treat their patients and customer base on an ongoing basis once they go away is important to them. And we're sitting at a time now where we know that there are certain corporate practices that are sitting without vets. We're talking about the difficulty in recruiting staff, and I would argue that for a corporate practice, it's even harder. So we have, if you'd sold the practice and you were sentimentally attached to that and you really got on well with the team and you'd loved your clients, and to find that in a year's time, that practice was sitting without a veterinarian there able to service the clients because that particular corporate can't recruit, I think that would be a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah.
So don't assume that they're going to recruit any better than you.
And I think you're living in the area still a lot of the times. You often haven't just flown off and disappeared. So you're living in the area. You're still bumping into your old clients in the shops. You're still seeing those people. So you do, often you've had the same clinic for 25, 30 years. You've seen them through a few generations of pets, and you do develop that relationship. I think it's hard to, for a lot of vets to just sort of ignore that and, accept that their clients maybe aren't getting the attention they need.
Yeah. Okay. Really good points. Okay. Fabulous. Well, look, the one area, I wanted to talk about two areas before we finish up with this episode today. I'll give you a bit of a heads up. I wanted to talk for a moment about structure mistakes, and maybe this ties into the other area that I wanted to talk about, which is some of the critical areas for prepping for sale. And we've talked about the pure accounting side, so cleaning up the accounts. But I just want to look at this from stepping back and taking a bit of a more general approach to looking at if we say that selling a business is all about taking the value in the business and transferring that to a buyer, what are some of these things that are specific to the veterinary industry that business owners should be thinking about when they're prepping for exit. And this actually dovetails into the structure discussion. So let's start there. What are some of the mistakes that you see being made from a structuring perspective for businesses who are veterinary practices who are heading into exit?
So heading into exit, I guess in some ways, the structure you've got, you've got to really think. It depends how you're going to sell. If you're going to sell outright, then the structure you've got is the structure you've got, because to restructure at that point, you're not going to gain anything in terms of I'm thinking in terms of capital gains tax. So if you're maybe not structured as best as you could be in terms of capital gains tax when you sell, it's too late. It's going to catch you out at some point along the way. But if you're looking at bringing in somebody else, so you're going to be sharing the business with somebody, then you may need to restructure. If you, for example, in a discretionary trust, a family trust, you can't just bring them straight into that discretionary trust. So then you've got to decide, are you going to do get them to set up a trust and do a partnership of trust and have a partnership, or would you be better off changing over into a company and your trust owning the shares in a company, and then the new buyer would own shares in the company? So there's things like that. I think it's your structure is probably more important if you're looking at bringing somebody in than if you're selling outright.
Although some of the issues that, I do see from time to time relate also to, number one, there's if you're getting to a business early enough, you can make, structured changes. And so absolutely, I completely agree. You're talking about the business at the sale. But, say they come in 5 years prior to a sale, 3 years prior to a sale, you can do a bit of work on the structure to turn it into something that might be more tax effective at exit, depending on where the business.
Yeah, and especially if the business is going to be doing better over the next 3 years, because, if you're thinking about 3 years ahead, you're probably prepping your business so it's going to value higher. So if you restructure also when you're at a lower value, any penalties that you may incur for the restructure would obviously be lower as well.
And and sometimes there's this issue of, companies having, different share classes, and therefore that impacts the ability to access more business concessions and those sorts of things. So, so I guess it's just a general cleanup that can happen in relation.
And I guess with trust, who's been getting the distributions over the, the past year and things. So, where the capital gain would lie, depending on who the beneficiaries are and all of that as well.
And then at sale, though, I guess the other structure considerations that I see quite often is, and you probably don't see this as much because your clients have been with you, and so you've already prepared them. But I see this when I deal with clients perhaps who haven't been in as proactive an environment, where they lead into sale, they go and deal with the broker or the corporate advisor, and then they get all geared up for sale. For example, if they're operating out of a company structure and they're looking at a business sale, but they didn't realise perhaps some of the benefits that might be applicable to them if they had have looked at a share sale, or certain things like that. So, are there any? As I say, you probably see this less because you've worked with them, they had the opportunity to be proactive. But in terms of clients that have come into you at that late piece, do you ever see that sort of issue, that they're just this lack of understanding about the different ways that they could sell?
I think they don't understand the different way to sell. They just feel they're selling the clinic. So they don't really sort of see that they could be selling an entity, that they don't see the different ways. And also just in terms of if they are going to sell the shares, cleaning out the company with, if they've got, for example, directors' loans sitting there, or those sorts of things sitting there. So that sort of thing being considered. I think the other thing sort of you've touched on is sometimes people aren't aware of the tax implications of their sales. So they think they're getting this high value for the clinic. But if they're not structured well, or sometimes despite whatever structure they have, they actually still got a fair bit of tax to pay. And it really affects what their final figure is. And they really need to take that into consideration. If they think they're going to have enough to live on, it may be significantly less by the time they've looked at the tax implications.
That is such a good point, because I have seen, I am absolutely not an accountant. This is not financial from my side. But, because I see so many businesses that are coming into sale, literally before I even start talking about the legal side, the first thing I say is, okay, have you sat down and worked this flow through with your accountant? Do you know what cash will end up in your pocket at the end of the day?
Yeah.
And I promise you, other than clients that I deal with of yours, of course, so often the answer is no. Do you know what? I just haven't sat down and worked. I don't know. And I'm just like, okay, well, that is so urgent, that discussion. It is so urgent. Can you maybe paint a picture? Have you got any examples there in your toolkit of perhaps clients that you've dealt with who haven't realised this, and some of the differences in the choices that they've made that have impacted how much they've had in their pocket at the end of the day?
I think the problem with us is we have a very close relationship with our clients. So we know as soon as they're thinking of selling, and then we'll already start to bring these things up to them. So we generally don't see the negatives because we've forewarned them as soon as we hear that they're thinking of selling, and sometimes they've delayed selling as a result. But we've started to prime them in advance. So our clients are fairly educated.
But just 2 weeks ago, I had one who was looking at introducing a partner into their business. And his question to me, he was like, after the discussion, he was like, do I pay tax on that? Not how much tax. So the reality is you don't expect, don't assume that your business owners know. Just don't assume because you've been working as an accountant for X number of years, business owners will know that there's good, because odds are for a lot of people, it's going to be like they've only ever done this once. They don't assume that they're going to know that there's, like, you've got to tell them you're going to pay tax on that. That's stage one, realization that there's going to be tax on that. And because some of them might know.
Yeah, but I guess that also comes back to, doesn't it, that decision about how you're actually going to do it? Because, of course, if we've got this partnership of trust versus if we're issuing shares versus if we're selling shares, I guess quite often there's just that, in fact, very, very often across the board, and it completely makes sense, there's a lack of perhaps complete understanding about that difference between the issuing shares or versus transferring shares, where the money will actually go from that or all of that side, right, which are things that I guess we deal with so often that we think, people might think about, but it really isn't. Like, this is our world. This is not at all the world.
Yeah, all they think about is they're selling their business for X amount of money. That's all they see, and they don't understand anything other than that.
Yeah, which is completely understandable. But I guess it's hard, it's a call out to, I guess, all of the accountants out there who are dealing with your clients. It's super important to understand that they don't really, there's no reason why they should understand this, because they deal with it so rarely that it's just not a normal business.
And as soon as they're bringing up that they're thinking about selling, I think it's up to the accountant to really be bringing up all these things to making them aware. And that's definitely what we try and do is, as soon as we hear when that they might be selling, we immediately start sort of bringing up all these things so they're aware long before they've actually even found their buyer.
That proactivity.
And what we've actually done is we've got a whole lot of online educational videos and webinars that we've done on prior valuation processes and stuff.
Great.
And we give them access to all those materials, because even hearing it once, like, as you can appreciate, it's complicated stuff. It's something you can listen to a couple of times. So at least they understand sort of the normalization adjustments that get done, add backs, all that sort of stuff. We do a number of courses on buy sells and this exact issue, selling shares versus just selling goodwill, plant and equipment, and offering them some kind of materials that helps them understand. Because you can tell, like, you can see sometimes when you're having this discussion with a client, once you get 5 minutes into it, the eyes just glaze over, and it's information overload because there's so much for them to learn in one hit. So having some kind of resource available to them, I think for any accountant, like regardless which industry you're in, I would think it's good to have some kind of resource that they can refer back to. I think would be really handy for them.
Now, can you tell us where our listeners go to find that? Because I think it's really important that we that we direct all of our listeners to where that is in case they're interested.
Well, we have an educational website called vetbusinessuniversity.com, all one word, vetbusinessuniversity.com. It's a subscription-based site. It's a fairly affordable month-by-month fee, but it's got a whole lot of practice management stuff in there, and it's got a whole lot of stuff on valuations. And in fact, we've even got at our aplaccountants.com.au website, if you actually go and search on that website, valuations, we've got some valuation web events that Anne and I have run for clients where we discuss all the ins and outs of business valuations.
That is fabulous. What a great resource. Okay, and we'll link through to it in our show notes as always. Okay, now before we round up, I can't stop asking questions. So excited by this topic today, but we're probably running overtime. So I'm going to, but I just want to cover a couple of quick things first. Just looking at this prep into exit, I'd just like to step back and have a bit of a think about where the value in a veterinary practice is, and for how do we ensure, what are the sorts of other things other than just the pure accounting, but happy for you to throw in more accounting sides as well, that we should be thinking about as we're approaching exit in this industry. And one of the things, just to kick it off, staff is obviously such an important element in this industry, but so is the relationship that staff can have with your client. So I think it's important anyway to be thinking about non-solicitation clauses in your agreements with your staff, but certainly going into sale, that's something that a buyer either will, or if not will, should be looking at, in terms of understanding the preservation of the value of the client base for the staff who might have some of those ongoing relationships. So that's one thing that sort of has stuck out for me in this industry. I mean, it's important in many industries, but certainly in this industry as well. Are there other things that that have popped out to you?
Just back onto your staff, I think vets can be a little bit sometimes casual in terms of their employment contracts.
Yeah.
So you will find a number of veterinary businesses that really don't have employment contracts or don't necessarily have good employment contracts. So it is something that you'd want to get properly in place if you're thinking of selling, and not scaring your staff, making your staff, it's going to be better for you that we've got a proper contract, not even that you're selling or anything, but just that, there's better contracts in place for people.
Yes. Be, having more of a business mind to how we're conducting the practice. Yeah, absolutely.
And then because valuation is so heavily based on profitability, it's really just looking at those areas in your business that you're not doing as well as what you could in terms of professional services. So where you could actually be running a better business, which would improve your profitability and therefore the value. So it's all part of that sort of planning. So you've got
and
better.
As you're talking about the service lines and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think particularly in the veterinary market, and I don't know how this ports to other businesses, but vets are quite diverse in what they do. They're a doctor, they're a dentist, they're a surgeon, and any veterinary surgeon, if you look at the variety of items that they invoice in many veterinary practices, it exceeds 1,000 items. So you look at an accounting firm like ours, you've had maybe an arsenal of about 20 or 30 different things to invoice. In a veterinary practice, there's a lot of moving parts, and invariably, even high net profit margin practices are neglecting a certain component of their pharmacy or their hospital or their consulting or their X-ray facilities or their laboratory facilities because they have in-house laboratories. So it's very, very it's always very, very good for practices if you're planning for a sale to have a look at all these areas of your business, and invariably you'll find a few key areas where which are being underutilized, and you can improve profitability a bit further for those 3 years to improve the sale.
And also checking your reminder systems, that the reminders, as many reminders that you should be doing, you're doing, and that they're going out properly, so that you're making sure that's all in place.
Well,
it's good.
It's another moving part of the business. In a veterinary practice, you have to recall all your patients for annual vaccinations. And it's a key element of the veterinary business, because for every vaccination you do, 1 out of every 4 of those patients will actually have something clinically wrong with them, because pets only live for 10 to 15 years. So they get older quicker. So you check them up every year, and invariably they'll have a lump that needs removing, or they'll have bad teeth, or they'll have a bad ear. So that reminder system is a key element of ongoing profits for the business. So if that's been neglected, again, it needs fixing and will improve the value of the
It's a really good point. Such a good point. And I guess also, we did touch on it in part 1. And if you haven't heard part 1, make sure you go back and listen to that. But the lease, having a lease in place, but that which is a particular issue if it's a premises that you own through your SMSF, having the right, a proper and standard commercial terms in your lease, having that on board before you exiting, so that can roll on to the buyer, is also something really to be thinking about, I think. Good. Anything else there that we haven't covered?
Well, I don't know.
Nothing springs to mind. We could probably come up with a whole new section.
We could do part 3 another day.
Well, actually, one other thing I guess I throw in there, just for, and this is probably from a legal perspective, but thinking about brand protection as well. I think once again the veterinary industry is perhaps a little bit slower on the uptake of that brand protection as a whole than many other industries that we deal with. But brand can be it can be a really important element if you're a multi-practice environment, I think. So, quite often many of the practices are localised to a particular geographic location. Obviously, it's relevant to the type of business it is, where distance is a key factor. But, where you're thinking about the potential of multiple practices, I think brand protection is something that really should be considered as well. And so I guess that's just one thing that I'd throw out there that comes to mind. Excellent. Well, look, I think that's it for today. I just want to say an absolutely massive thank you. We have covered a whole heap. I've actually got a lot more questions, but I think we've run out of time before I ran out of questions. Can I just say thank you so much, Anne and Paolo, for coming on to the Deal Room podcast today. It's been a really, I've had a lot of fun. I hope you've had fun.
We have.
Yeah,
Thanks, Joanna.
It's always fun.
Lots to think about and talk about.
There is. Now, maybe if you can just give a shout out if any of our listeners, whether they be brokers who are dealing with veterinary practices who want or who want to get access to someone who knows how to value their veterinary practice, whether it's accountants who need the assistance of a specialist or whether it's buyers or sellers themselves, where can they find you?
They can go to our website, so www.aplaccountants.com.au, and all our details are on there for everyone.
Fabulous. Okay, and of course, as always, we'll link this through in our show notes and on our website, so you don't have to worry if you're running along at the moment and you can't jot that down. Just head over to our website and our show notes and we'll have it all there. Massive thank you to you for both of your time today.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thanks, Joanna. That's awesome.
All right, that's it for part 2 of our 2-part series, and that finishes up our series talking all about the veterinary industry, valuations and merger and acquisition activity. So if you'd like more information about this topic, just head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com, where you'll be able to get in contact with Anne and Paolo, and you will also be able to get in contact with our lawyers at Aspect Legal if you or your clients would like to discuss any legal aspects of sales or acquisitions. And that's it. So if you enjoyed what you heard today, then I'd love it if you could possibly head into your favourite podcast player and leave us a review. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button as well on your way out. Well, that's it for today's episode and the finalisation of our 2-part series. You've been listening to Joanna Oakey and the Deal Room Podcast, a podcast very proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. See you next time. Aspect Legal has a number of great services that help businesses prepare for a sale or acquisition, to help them prepare in advance and to get transaction ready. We've also got a range of services to help guide businesses through the sale and acquisitions process. We work with clients both big and small and have different types of services depending on size and complexity. We provide a free consultation to discuss your proposed sale or acquisition. So see our show notes on how to book a time to speak with us, or head over to our website at aspectlegal.com.au.
Ladies and gentlemen.
That will conclude this evening's entertainment.
Thanks for listening to the Deal Room Podcast. To find out more about this episode and other episodes in the series, check out the show notes or head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com.au.